Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Turok 3 Shadow of Oblivion, originally released exclusively for the Nintendo 64, but after 23 years of N64 exclusivity, it's finally been remastered for PC, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, and Nintendo Switch, and what you'll be seeing throughout this video is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Turok 2 Seeds of Evil. It was originally developed and published by Acclaim Entertainment, with the remaster being done by Nightdive Studios, much like they did with the original Turok and Turok 2. It was originally released in September of 2000 to a generally fairly positive reception, although given other games that came out around that time, it was seen as a bit underwhelming. I mean, you have to remember, Perfect Dark released earlier that year. That's a bit of a titan as far as Nintendo 64 exclusive first-person shooters go, and the frankly borderline unplayable on N64 Turok 3 just wasn't going to hold up. I say borderline unplayable because the frame rate was absolutely atrocious, and that was something they acknowledged back then as well. And when Nintendo 64 diehards are saying that the frame rate in a game is really bad to the point of barely being playable, you know you're dealing with a really bad frame rate, because they could put up with damn near anything. Thankfully, the remaster runs smooth as butter, so you don't need to worry about the frame rate in that. You can play it theoretically the way the game was intended to be played, although the remaster is lacking the multiplayer mode that was present in the original Nintendo 64 release. It seems Nightdive decided that it really wasn't worth the effort to try to port over the multiplayer because nobody remembers the multiplayer in any of the Turok games, so it's pretty understandable why they left it out, although I know there are some people who are going to be a bit miffed about that. Now personally, I've never really cared about multiplayer in Turok because the original game was single player only. I've always seen the second game as a single player oriented game with multiplayer that was just tacked on, and Turok 3 is basically no exception there. Mainly a single player game, but with multiplayer tacked on. So I'm not really all that concerned about it. Now I should mention before I go any further, I have not played the original version of Turok 3 on the N64. I just haven't been able to track down a copy of it for anything remotely resembling an affordable price, and since my access to N64 back in the day was very, very limited, I didn't get a chance to play it back then either. So not only do I have absolutely no nostalgia for this game whatsoever, I was going into the remaster with a pretty fresh perspective. The only thing I really had expectations for was, would they take the gameplay from Turok 2 and improve upon it? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into this and see what exactly we're dealing with here. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, but you do have to keep in mind that I'm reviewing the remastered version, which includes the remastered graphics. I did reduce a few of the settings to get it more like the original game, so it doesn't have things like bloom lighting and such in it. Although I did make use of the FOV slider because, let's face it, that just makes sense to do. Anyway, as far as the visuals are concerned, well, it looks like a Nintendo 64 game that has had textures upscaled and a lot of edges that were very rough in the original, smoothed out with more modern engine features. It's basically the same kind of treatment that Turok 1 and 2 got, and it looks fine, all things considered. I mean, this is a 23-year-old game at this point. You have to cut it some slack as far as the visuals are concerned. And as far as looking back on a game like that goes, as long as there's not really anything in the visuals that interferes with your ability to play the game, I don't really see it as being a problem. And if you're going back to it, you just need to understand that you're going to be dealing with very old blocky modeling, low-res textures, even with the remaster's upscaling, and rather limited effects. They certainly did what they could with what they had back in the day, and it does have a few interesting features, like lip syncing with regards to the voice acting, although it's definitely a very primitive, very early lip sync. But that just wasn't really a thing for Nintendo 64 games, so it's kind of impressive that they decided to put it in here, as much as they were able to put it in here anyway. But there's not really anything that truly stands out in terms of visuals. Even the artistic design of the game just isn't quite as striking as the previous game was, and even to some degree the original Turok. And it certainly doesn't help that there are certain aspects of the game's design that were clearly done for performance reasons in the original that are relics of archaic design in the remastered version. They don't really need to be there, but the game's still designed this way. Things like enemies literally teleporting in as opposed to being strategically placed, or the way the levels are cut into very small chunks that you go through, which were clearly done to try to maximize performance in the original game, that are not really necessary with the remaster, but that's the way the game's designed and they can't really get around it. I mean, after all, with regards to the remasters for Turok 1 and 2, Nightdive had the original PC versions to work with, and those were just far more technically capable than the original Nintendo 64 versions were. With Turok 3, they didn't have a PC version to go off of. All they had was the original Nintendo 64 code, and that just shows when it comes to the presentation. It's not just in the visual department, it's even in the sound department. The sound quality is a bit all over the place. I mean, on the one hand, the music is fine, although audio quality aside, the music in this is just nowhere near as good as the soundtrack in Turok 2 was. I mean, that soundtrack kicks all kinds of ass, whereas the soundtrack in Turok 3 is just bland and completely forgettable. And the sound effects are mostly fine, although they're not particularly impressive, but the voice acting is very heavily bit crushed, and it seems like they just couldn't get access to original recordings that would have been a much higher quality. The audio quality, however, is kind of the least of the voice acting's problems because it's very much late 90s, very early 2000s, kind of budget game voice acting, which is to say it's not very good.
Joshua spoke of you often. He's dead. I know. Be still now, the council is here.
It all comes across as rather stilted and awkward, and Joseph sounds a lot whinier than I think he was really intended to sound.
There's the breach across the street. I need to get there.
Now, admittedly, this isn't really anything all that unusual for the era. Voice acting in most games around this time was not very good, but there is one aspect of the voice acting that you could outright say is a sin compared to the previous games. They got rid of the "I am Turok" line. I'm not entirely sure why they did it this way, but it just doesn't feel right without the "I am Turok" line whenever you max out those life force points. Anyway, when you bring all the presentation together, you end up with something that looked decent for a Nintendo 64 game, although the frame rate was terrible back then. Thankfully, the remaster has a buttery smooth frame rate, and they did implement a few extra engine features that weren't present in the original, so it does look a bit more modern, although I would still say that you should get rid of the motion blur and the bloom lighting as soon as you can when you start the game up, because those definitely impact the aesthetics of the original game, and it's better off without them. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this takes place about 2 years after the events of Turok 2 Seeds of Evil, with the main protagonist of Turok 2, Joshua Fireseed, having dreams of the arrival of Oblivion, the world-eating creature that was teased at the end of Turok 2. Soon after having this dream, Joshua tells his sister Danielle that she must not let the Fireseed lineage die out, before Oblivion spawn arrive and attack him. Joshua sacrifices himself against the Oblivion spawn so that Danielle and their younger brother Joseph can escape, and shortly afterward, Adon, the woman who was advising Joshua throughout the events of Turok 2, arrives to whisk the two of them away and bring them to the Council of Voices, who proceed to tell them that with the death of Joshua, those two are the only ones who can take up the mantle of Turok. So one of them must choose to become Turok and fight the forces of Oblivion, eventually working their way towards Oblivion itself, and defeat this world-devouring entity that poses an existential threat to the entire universe. But while only one of them can actually become Turok, both of them go on the journey anyway, and they help each other out, at least in terms of the cutscenes. In the actual gameplay, you don't get to interact with the other sibling from the one you choose. Now, regardless of which sibling you pick, the story is ultimately the same. You'll fight your way through 6 levels, ultimately working your way towards defeating Oblivion once and for all, and along the way there are a series of cutscenes that fill in what passes for a storyline in this game, which is to say, there barely is a story in this game. You would think with there being a fair few cutscenes in the game that there would be some story, but there isn't. You just go from level to level, which is interconnected by portals and has almost nothing to do with each other thematically, and at the end of it, you track down Oblivion and beat the crap out of them. They try to throw in some mystery with the Council of Voices and show them as having ulterior motives behind things that are never explained in the game and don't go anywhere. And they throw in a bit about potentially being able to save Joshua Fireseed from his grisly fate, but that doesn't really go anywhere either, ultimately leaving the player with a sense of dissatisfaction with the way the story concludes. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not like Turok 1 and 2 had much going on in terms of storyline either, but the thing is, they were very clearly 90s FPSs where storyline didn't really matter much. You just needed the setup and that was it. Turok 3, on the other hand, gives the impression that there's going to be more in terms of storyline, but then it just fails to deliver. And while you might think that going through the game as both siblings would give you more in terms of storyline, it really doesn't. Again, they just go through the same storyline regardless, it's just that a couple of the cutscenes change very slightly because you're playing as one sibling over the other, and the main difference between them is just going to be the mechanical differences. This ultimately means that, like most 90s and very early 2000s first-person shooters, it all falls to the gameplay to hold Turok 3 up. So what exactly are we dealing with here? Well, if you've played Turok 2, it's going to be a pretty familiar experience for you in terms of the general gameplay experience. You navigate the various levels, climb ladders, do a bit of platforming here and there, blast the living crap out of the enemies with a variety of weapons, which do vary depending on which character you're playing. And as was standard for the era, there's no regenerating health or 2-weapon limit or anything like that. You get a weapon wheel in the remastered version, whereas in the original version you would just cycle through your various weapons. And of course the remastered version on PC lets you use the number keys to switch between the weapons as well. And as you navigate the levels, you'll find healing items, ammunition for your various weapons, and floating diamonds, which are individual life force points. Once you get 100 of those points, then the counter resets, you gain 10 extra health points, and your health refills to max. And as this game was released before more modern trends really took hold, there are secret areas to find which might give you access to certain weapons early, or simply give you access to health and ammo caches that you'll find are pretty desperately needed sometimes. Now I should note that I did play through the entire game twice, once as Danielle on hard mode, and then again as Joseph on normal difficulty. And the change in difficulty is fairly typical for the era. The enemies are a bit more resilient, they're a bit more accurate, and they do more damage. Unfortunately, they're not really any smarter though, because they still either just hang back and shoot at you if they have some sort of ranged weapon, or if they're a melee enemy, then they'll just run right up to you and start trying to attack you in melee. Some enemies do have multiple forms of attack, however. For example, the Oblivion spawn that you'll encounter fairly late in the game have a large blade that they'll run up to you and start swinging at you with, but they also will throw grenades at you while they close in. The enemy design, however, is unfortunately one of the points where the game starts failing a bit, because there's really not that much variety in the enemies you're facing. I mean, after all, the game's only 6 levels long, and for at least 3 of them, the majority of enemies you're going to be fighting are just human enemies with guns and melee weapons, and frankly, they're pretty boring to fight. I mean, after all, this is a Turok game. You expect to be fighting more creatures than just human or humanoid enemies that shoot at you. And unfortunately, for a good chunk of the game, that's just what you end up doing in Turok 3, and it doesn't really have the room for that to not be a problem. A single playthrough of this game, pretty much regardless of your difficulty setting, is going to be about 2 hours long. By the time I got through both of my playthroughs, once as Danielle in hard mode and once as Joseph in normal difficulty, I had played the game for about 4.5 hours. With the game being that short, they really needed to pack it full of good content, and unfortunately, with the enemy designs being as lackluster as they are, you never really get an opportunity to fight enemies that feel truly challenging or interesting to engage with. In fact, some of them are hyped up to be really powerful entities, and they go down with a single arrow like it's nothing. Which of course brings me to one of the bigger issues I have with this game, which is the rather inconsistent damage modeling. Like it or not, Turok 1 and 2's combat was at least mostly consistent. There were a few weird issues here and there, but it was never anything really to write home about. Turok 3, on the other hand, suffers from this issue constantly, where you'll shoot an enemy in the head and it won't do anything to them. But then you'll shoot another enemy of the exact same type in the head, and it'll knock their head off with a single shot. Some enemies you can just hose down with gunfire, and it takes a lot of shots before they go down, but then another enemy of the exact same type, you shoot once in the arm, their arm flies off, and they die instantly. Launch a grenade or a rocket at an enemy, sometimes you can hit them directly in the face, and they'll just tank it like it's nothing. Other times, you'll shoot it at their legs, and they go flying and die instantly. It is so wildly inconsistent and all over the place, regardless of which weapon you're using, regardless of which enemy you're fighting, that just leaves you scratching your head wondering what the hell is happening. Because of this wild inconsistency, you don't get the same kind of of effect that the weapons in Turok 1 and especially Turok 2 had. I mean, Turok 2 has some really good feeling weapons, including one of the most awesome weapons to ever exist in first-person shooter history, the Cerebral Bore. Well, they bring back the Cerebral Bore, and it does kind of the same thing that it did in the previous game, except they toned down the audio-visual effects for it so it just doesn't look or sound as cool as it did in Turok 2. They even gave it a couple of upgraded versions in the form of the Cerebral Possessor, which latches onto an enemy and gives you very brief control over that enemy, although you can't really do a whole lot with it. And once that brief period of control expires, then the Cerebral Bore explodes and takes their head along with it and kills them instantly. The other one is the Cerebral Burst, which latches onto an enemy and then I think it's supposed to do splash damage to nearby enemies because they will run towards other enemies and then it will explode. But because of the wild inconsistency in damage output, it didn't seem to do anything other than just waste time as far as I could tell, so there wasn't much of a reason to use it. I mean, if there was one thing that the weapons in Turok 2 did really well, it was make you feel like a badass for using them. The shotgun, for example, felt really beefy and powerful, and then when you got access to explosive shells, that made it even better. Now, you get a shotgun, and it's okay. It does kind of the same thing that a basic pistol does because it's so inconsistent, like with every other weapon. And the spread on it has been dramatically increased for some baffling reason. And they replaced the explosive shells with either a shotgun that will set enemies on fire for gradual damage over time, or one that shoots pellets that ricochet off of walls until they hit something, and neither of those upgrades are particularly satisfying to use in favor of the standard shotgun blast. I mean, hell, even the explosive weapons like the grenade launcher and rocket launcher are just not satisfying to use because of how inconsistent the damage output is. The only consistently powerful feeling weapon I ran across was the Storm Bow, which is only available to Joseph, and it's the upgrade he gets for the bow, much like with Danielle getting the Tech Bow instead, which returns from Turok 2, of course, and shoots explosive arrows. But the Storm Bow it's just a crossbow. It just shoots a basic arrow that fires instantly as opposed to having to be charged up like a regular bow shot. And even though it was the most consistent weapon throughout both of my playthroughs, it wasn't very satisfying to use because, I mean, it's just a crossbow. It's not really all that interesting. So while you do have the arsenal split between the two playable characters, such that Danny's unique weapons include her melee weapon being a tomahawk, and then for her upgraded weapons you get the 3-round burst pistol, a chain gun, a rocket launcher, the flame-spewing shotgun, the cerebral burst, and the tech bow, versus Joseph having a knife as a melee weapon and then getting, instead of the 3-round burst pistol, a silenced pistol, which doesn't seem to matter much because there's not really a stealth system in this game, so I don't know why they put that in there, as well as getting the Shredder, which is the ricocheting shotgun upgrade, a sniper rifle instead of the chain gun, the storm bow instead of the tech bow, a napalm launcher instead of a rocket launcher, and the cerebral possessor instead of the cerebral burst. Actually playing through the game as both characters is not really all that different of an experience. I mean, you're going through the same levels with a relatively ineffective arsenal regardless of which character you're playing, and the only major difference in gameplay between them is that Danny is a bit taller and can jump a bit higher than Joseph can, and she gets access to a grappling hook which allows her to ascend over obstacles, whereas Joseph is shorter and thus he can't jump as high, but he also can squeeze into small tight spaces so he can go around things that way instead of going above them like Danny does with the grappling hook. And that just results in a few of the side areas that you access being slightly different depending on which character you're playing. Ultimately, you are experiencing the same campaign regardless, with the same storyline and the same unsatisfying arsenal and same unsatisfying enemy roster. Even the boss fights aren't particularly interesting. The first of them is a very straightforward boss fight where the enemy is attacking you and you just have to reduce its health bar to 0. But once you're past that first boss, all of the rest of them have some sort of gimmick associated with them, and it's usually a rather weak gimmick that at best is a mild inconvenience to you just annihilating the enemy without it putting up much of a fight, and at worst is just outright annoying because it drags out the fight far longer than it needs to, like with the lava monster that you had to fight, and you have to continually divert your attention away from that particular enemy so that you can stop it from healing itself. And that just ends up being a tedious fight rather than an interesting one. Even the final boss of the game, Oblivion itself, is just a really dull fight that is ultimately really unsatisfying. And when you bring all that together, you end up with a really wimpy follow-up to what was actually a pretty solid first-person shooter in the form of Turok 2, which had learned from the mistakes of its predecessor and had improved quite noticeably. In Turok 3, on the other hand, not only is the campaign incredibly short, but the enemies just aren't interesting to fight, the weapons aren't interesting to use, the combat itself feels wildly inconsistent at all times, regardless of which difficulty you're playing it on. The storyline is weak and ultimately doesn't go anywhere. The level design is far more linear and segmented than what we saw in the previous games, both because of hardware limitations on the N64 at the time, and because for whatever reason they decided it would be better to have a more linear structure, maybe to try to combat people being a bit confused about the level design of the previous games, which wasn't as big of a problem in Turok 2, of course, except for the Lair of the Blind Ones. But of course, there were still people confused by the level design of Turok 2, so maybe they did decide to make it more linear to try to cut down on that, the end result just being not as interesting to navigate as Turok 2. And even when you go beyond core gameplay mechanics and look at some of the more superficial stuff, the visual aesthetics just aren't as interesting as the previous game. The soundtrack just isn't as good or memorable as the previous game. I mean, hell, the Port of Adia, the opening level from Turok 2, that song still stays rent-free in my head to this day, whereas I can't name a single track from Turok 3 because they're all so bland. The end result of all this is a very weak conclusion to the N64 trilogy that feels like it was just rushed out the door to try to get some extra bucks from the Nintendo 64 crowd before the next generation of consoles really took over. I mean, by this point, the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2 were already out, and the GameCube and Xbox would come out the following year. The N64 was just in its final days, and it really does show here. They were trying to do what they could with what they had, but the performance on the original hardware was terrible, and the end result is a really lackluster conclusion to the Turok N64 trilogy. And while the dual protagonist idea was certainly interesting, unfortunately it just ended up being a gimmick more than anything else. But where does that leave us today? Well, at least they've sorted out the performance issues and made the game actually playable on modern systems with the remastered version. But they're also charging $30 US for it, which seems really high for a game that's only about 4 hours long across 2 playthroughs, and there's not really any replay value in it beyond that, where you would just play through it once as Danny and once as Joseph. I mean, sure, you can bump up the difficulty, but once you know where the enemies are and what challenges you're going to face through one playthrough, there's not going to be that much of a difference with the other character, and what differences do exist are so minimal that they just don't make playing through the game a second time really worth it. And unfortunately for most players, Turok 3 is going to be something you can very easily pass on. If you're a diehard Turok fan, you played through the previous 2 games and you absolutely love them and you have to know how the next game is, maybe pick up the remastered version of this if it goes on sale for a really good price, and I mean well under $20. Because the previous 2 games remasters were $20 each when they launched, and frankly they were an infinitely better value at $20 than this game is even really at $10, honestly. So if you're interested but haven't taken the plunge into the Turok series yet, I would recommend going and playing the remastered version of Turok 2 Seeds of Evil. It is easily the best game in the entire franchise. And while it certainly has its issues, it actually still holds up pretty well. Turok 1 I would really only recommend to enthusiasts of that particular era of first-person shooters because it has a lot more issues that were more or less rectified in Turok 2 that make it a lot more difficult to get into. And Turok 3, overall, I just wouldn't recommend at all, but if you absolutely must play all the Turok games, well, let me put it this way. As weak as Turok 3 is, at least it's not the reboot from 2008. I will, of course, have links in the video description box to where you can grab this game on Steam or GOG if you are interested in it. But again, I would very highly recommend you wait for a deep discount on it if you are interested. Because overall, again, I just don't really recommend it as far as a general playing experience goes. It is interesting to look at from a historical perspective, of course, but as far as actually playing it goes, I can't really say I had fun the entire time I was playing it. It was just mediocre at best. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit does help. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.